November 8th, 1975. The mouth of the Daugava River at Riga. A grey anti-submarine frigate of the Soviet Baltic Fleet sits at her mooring under a low sky, dressed overall for the anniversary of the revolution. 3,500 tons of welded steel, a crew of 190 men in service blues on the foredeck. Below the bridge, 2 decks down, fists are hammering on the inside of a steel cabin door. The captain of this warship is the man hammering. His own political officer locked him in his cabin an hour ago. 3 hours from now, that frigate slips her cables. By midnight, she clears the Gulf of Riga. By dawn, every attack squadron the Baltic Fleet can put in the air is hunting for her. She has not been taken by the West. She has not been hijacked by terrorists. She has been seized, with her own command crew on board, by a single Soviet officer who decided that night to broadcast a manifesto against the Politburo of the Soviet Union. It will be the first armed mutiny inside the Soviet Navy since Kronstadt in 1921. 54 years of silence, broken by one man with a typewriter and a reel of tape. His name is Valery Mikhailovich Sablin, Captain 3rd rank, 36 years old. The political officer, the Zampolit, of the warship Storozhevoy. The Storozhevoy, the Sentry, is a Krivak-class anti-submarine frigate, recently commissioned from the Yantar yards in Kaliningrad, the pride of the new Baltic flotilla. Above her bridge flies the red ensign of the Soviet Navy. By the next morning, her white name on a grey transom will be on the desk of Yuri Andropov, chairman of the KGB in Moscow. Why is a Soviet political officer, the one man on board paid, trained, and watched to enforce loyalty above all else, about to steal his own ship? And where, if not to the West, is he taking her? To answer the first question, you have to start with the man. Valery Sablin was born in Leningrad on the 1st of January 1939. His father, Mikhail Petrovich Sablin, was a career officer of the Soviet Navy. By the time the boy enrolled in school, the father was a captain 1st rank, a man who had survived the northern convoys and brought himself home alive with most of his decorations. There was always a uniform on the back of a chair in the apartment. There was a service revolver on the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, broken down for cleaning while the boy did his homework. There were portraits of Lenin and of Admiral Ushakov on the wall above the boy's bunk. At 17, he applied to the Frunze Higher Naval School in Leningrad. He was accepted on the first try. He graduated in 1960 with the rank of lieutenant. 8 years at sea followed. Destroyers in the Northern Fleet, escorts in the Black Sea, junior assignments across 3 flotillas. Long enough to be in the wardrooms when the news of Khrushchev's fall came over the wires from Moscow. Long enough to learn what an admiral's table looked like from below it. Then, in 1969, the assignment that changed everything. The Lenin Military Political Academy in Moscow. 4 years inside the building that produced the Soviet Navy's political officers, the men whose duty was to remind every sailor in every wardroom why the system was worth dying for. He read Lenin in 3 editions. He read Marx end to end. He graduated with honors in 1973. He believed every word. That is the part nobody in the West would later understand. Sablin was not a defector by instinct. He was a true believer who looked around in the early 70s and concluded that the believers had been betrayed. He saw it in the wardrooms. The captains who got commands because their fathers had golf partners on the general staff. The admirals whose dachas grew while their crews stood in line for shoes. The Politburo that handed itself medals while half the Soviet Union queued for sausage. He had been promised, by every book and every lecture inside the academy, a republic of workers. What he watched from a junior officer's wardroom was an aristocracy of paperwork. In the spring of 1973, between Moscow and his next posting, he sat down at a Czech-made typewriter borrowed from his wife Nina and began to write. A speech, an address to the nation. He revised it through the next 2.5 years, page by page, in train compartments and cabin desks and the kitchens of borrowed flats, until the folder ran to more than 40 typed sheets. He carried it everywhere, slipped inside the lining of his uniform jacket. He carries it tonight, hand on the steel paperclip through the wool, walking from the captain's locked cabin toward the wardroom 3 decks above. In the small locker under his bunk lies a reel-to-reel tape, about 15 minutes of audio. His own voice, recorded into a borrowed deck the previous month in a hotel room 3 streets from the harbor, reading from the Manifesto. He intends to broadcast that tape from the radio room of his own ship, over the open military frequency, on every shortwave band the Storozhevoy carries, until somebody in Moscow finds an honest man and answers him. He believes on this November morning that there is still an honest man left in Moscow. But right now, the Manifesto is still hidden under his jacket, the tape is still silent in its locker, and the captain of the Storozhevoy is still hammering on a cabin door 3 decks below. To understand how a man trained to be the loudest voice of the Soviet system ended up locking the Soviet system's captain inside his own quarters, the camera has to walk back. Back to Leningrad in the winter of 1945. Back to a boy who grew up reading Lenin in the kitchen while his father cleaned a service revolver at the table. And forward to the night of November 6th, 1975. Exactly 48 hours before the mutiny, when Sablin sat down across from a 22-year-old conscript sailor named Alexander Shane in the empty mess deck and asked Shane the question that would define both of their lives. Leningrad in 1945 was a city of plywood windows and missing apartments. The siege had ended a year earlier. 750,000 dead in those streets, mostly of hunger. Whole blocks of buildings stood empty because the families that had filled them no longer existed. In one of those apartments, on the embankment near the Frunze school, lived the Sablins. The father, Captain Mikhail Petrovich, had spent the war on northern convoy escorts running into Murmansk. He came home in the spring of 45 with a chest of decorations he never displayed, and a habit of speaking to his son as if every word were an order he expected to be carried out. The boy was 6 years old. His earliest clear memory was of his father at the kitchen table on a winter Sunday, the service revolver broken down on a square of oilcloth, cleaning each component with a strip of flannel, while the son did his sums on the same table. The father did not look up from the work. The father did not ask about the homework. Both of them understood that the silence was a form of conversation, and that to interrupt it would have been impolite. Above the boy's bunk hung 2 pictures, Lenin in profile with the goatee, Admiral Ushakov in a powdered wig, in the uniform of an 18th century flag officer of Catherine's Navy. Between them, on a small shelf, a photograph of the cruiser Aurora at her permanent mooring on the Neva. Every Soviet schoolchild knew that ship. Every Soviet schoolchild knew the blank charge round she had fired on the night of October 25th, 1917, to signal the storming of the Winter Palace. The boy had been taught, before he could read, that the Aurora was the loudest ship in history because she had spoken for the people. Years later, on the bridge of his own ship as it cleared the Gulf of Riga, Captain Sablin would set a course for Leningrad, for the Aurora. By 17, in 1956, he was a cadet at the Frunze Higher Naval School in his own city. 4 years of celestial navigation, gunnery, languages, and the political curriculum. The political curriculum was what he loved. He took Marxist-Leninist theory the way other cadets took to sea anchor knots. By his second year, his classmates were borrowing his notes. By his fourth year, he was teaching seminars to first years on contemporary applications of Lenin's State and Revolution. In 1960, he received his commission, the Northern Fleet at Severomorsk. Long cruises on destroyer escorts, watch officer, gunnery officer, then squadron training officer. He was good at the job, and his fitness report said so. He was also, by the recollection of 2 of his wardroom messmates, who would later be interviewed by Russian historians, the officer who sat at the table after dinner and asked, in a low voice, why the political officer's lecture that afternoon had said one thing and the regulations another. The questions did not get him into trouble. The questions got him sent to Moscow. In 1969, at the age of 30, Lieutenant Commander Sablin was admitted to the Lenin Military Political Academy, the 4-year course, the highest credential a Soviet political officer could hold, short of a directorship in the main political administration itself. He moved his wife Nina and his 7-year-old son Mikhail, Misha, from a damp 2-room flat in Severomorsk to a damper 2-room flat in a cinder block building outside the Moscow Ring Road. For 4 years, he read Lenin in 3 editions, including the unedited transcripts of the 10th Party Congress, Marx in the Russian translation and again in the German. Plekhanov, Bukharin, the early Trotsky, he was not supposed to be reading at all. He took notes in a series of school exercise books and kept the books in a locked drawer in the kitchen. It was somewhere in those 4 years that he stopped being a man with questions and became a man with an answer. The answer, when he could finally write it down, was simple enough to fit on the back of a single page. The revolution had been hijacked. Not in 1917, not in 1921 at Kronstadt, not even in 1937 in the cellars of Lubyanka. Hijacked later, slowly, by men who learned that the surest way to power inside a worker's state was to wear the right opinions like a tunic and never take them off. He graduated with honors in the summer of 1973. The first draft of the manifesto already lay folded inside a brown cardboard folder at the bottom of his desk drawer. His next posting was the Pacific Fleet, on a destroyer running training cruises out of Vladivostok. He served there for a year. Then, in the late autumn of 1974, came the orders that put him aboard a brand-new Krivak-class anti-submarine frigate, fresh out of the Yantar yards in Kaliningrad. Captain Second Rank Anatoly Patulny commanding, political officer Sablin. Through the spring and summer of 1975 he served. He took his political instruction watches. He delivered the prescribed lectures to the petty officers in the wardroom and to the conscripts in the mess deck. He spoke about Lenin, about the international proletariat, about the duty of every Soviet officer to the working class of the world. He used the language he had been taught at the academy. He meant every word of it. The crew, by every interview later recorded, liked him. The conscripts liked that he answered their questions instead of barking at them. The petty officers liked that he did not steal vodka. The officers found him a little strange, a man who spoke about Lenin the way village priests in the old days had spoken about saints. But Captain Potulny found him useful. A Zampolit who actually believed his own homilies was rarer in the fleet of the mid-70s than the regulations admitted. By the end of October 1975, the Storozhevoy was in Riga for the November anniversary celebrations. Tied up in line with 24 other warships of the Baltic Fleet, dressed overall in the freezing rain of the Daugava estuary. Sablin had a folder under his uniform jacket. He had a reel-to-reel tape recorded the previous month in a hotel room 3 streets from the harbour. He had read the manifesto out loud into the microphone of a borrowed deck and listened to himself afterward and decided, alone, that the voice was steady enough. He had one more thing to do before he could broadcast that voice. He needed a second man, who, on a ship of 190 men, could be trusted with the truth of what their political officer was actually planning. And what kind of man would say yes, knowing that the answer was a firing squad either way? Before we walk with him into the empty mess deck at midnight on the 6th of November to talk to Sailor Shine, a small pause. If a story about one Soviet officer who chose conscience over orders is the kind of story worth your evening, subscribe to the channel. It keeps stories like this one on the surface. Now, the rain is falling on the Daugava, and a 22-year-old conscript is about to be asked the most dangerous question of his life. Midnight, the 6th of November. The empty mess deck of the Storozhevoy. Sablin sits at one of the long tables with 2 enamel mugs of tea between him and sailor Alexander Shine. Shine is 22 years old, a conscript. He has been on the ship for less than a year. He likes the Zampolit because the Zampolit treats him as a man instead of as a uniform. Sablin puts the mugs down. He does not waste words. He tells the young sailor that in 2 days he intends to relieve Captain Potulny of command and take the Storozhevoy out of the Riga roadstead to broadcast a message to the country. He tells Shine that he expects to be tried for treason. He tells Shine the punishment is execution. He asks Shine to help him. Shine takes a long drink of cooling tea. He looks at the tabletop for the better part of a minute. Then he says yes. Sablin would later write, in his trial deposition, that he had picked Shine for one reason. The boy had once told him, in a political instruction class, that his grandfather had been a Red Army soldier shot in 1938 for anti-Soviet conversations. A man with that grandfather, Sablin reasoned, would understand what a Soviet officer was being asked to risk by refusing to live as a liar. Through the 7th of November, the ship goes through the motions. The Revolution Anniversary Parade slides down the Daugava in a slow line of grey warships dressed overall with signal flags. Bands play on the embankment. Officers stand at attention on the bridge wings. Sablin stands among them. Inside his jacket, the folder with the steel paperclip presses against his ribs. Evening, the 8th of November. The crew has been given liberty ashore in rotation through the day. By 2000 hours, most of the seamen are back on board. The officers have eaten in the wardroom. Captain Potulny is in his sea cabin, reviewing the next morning's orders to return to her home base. Sablin walks into the captain's sea cabin without knocking. He tells Potulny that there is a problem in the sonar compartment. He asks the captain to come and see for himself. Potulny is annoyed, tired, but he follows. Sablin leads him to a small compartment forward of the sonar room and gestures him inside. The captain steps through the hatch. Sablin closes the hatch behind him. He drops a steel pin into the locking bar. He turns and walks away. The captain begins almost at once to bang on the door. Sablin steps into the wardroom 3 minutes later. Sailor Shine is behind him with an old Makarov pistol in his belt. Sablin has signed it out of the small arms locker that afternoon on the pretext of an inspection. Sablin closes the wardroom door. He sets the reel-to-reel tape recorder on the long table. He takes the folder out from inside his jacket and lays it next to the recorder.
He tells the assembled officers,
14 of them, that the captain has been relieved. He tells them that the Storozhevoy is going to sea tonight to broadcast a message. He tells them that no harm will come to anyone who steps off the ship now, but that he requires a decision from every man before midnight. He plays the tape. For 15 minutes, the wardroom listens to its own Zampolit's voice from a hotel room 3 streets away. The voice talks about the workers' state and the men who have betrayed it. The voice names Brezhnev, Suslov, the Politburo by name. The voice asks the people of the Soviet Union to demand that the General Secretary appear on television within 24 hours and answer for the condition of the country. The voice does not raise itself. It does not need to. The tape ends. Sablin places a small wooden box on the table. Inside the box are 2 piles of drafts pieces, black on one side, white on the other. He asks each officer to take one and place it, hidden in a fist, into a second box that Shine passes around the room. Black for refusal, white for agreement. Estimates of the count later differ. The trial transcript records 8 white and 6 black. 2 of the surviving officers said in interviews years afterward that the white side had a clearer majority than that. What is certain is that Sablin had a majority, that the dissenters were marched aft and locked in a forward berth compartment under Shine's guard, and that by 2200 hours the ship's company had been assembled on the foredeck under a wash of yard lights. Sablin reads to them from the Manifesto. He reads for 19 minutes by the wardroom clock. He tells the crew where the ship is going and why. He tells them that anyone who wants to leave the ship now can do so over the side. 3 sailors take him up on the offer and lower themselves into the harbor water in their underwear. Nobody else moves. He turns to the bridge and orders the lines cast off. There is one mistake he does not know he is making. A senior lieutenant by the name of Firsov, who had been in the wardroom and who had cast a white piece without conviction, was allowed an hour earlier to step off the ship to fetch a personal item from a friend on a submarine moored alongside. Firsov reaches the submarine's gangway, looks back at the Storozhevoy as her lines come in, and walks instead to a duty office at the end of the pier. He picks up a telephone. By 23:30 hours, the duty captain at Riga Naval Headquarters is on a high-frequency line to Moscow. By 0100 hours on the 9th of November, the Storozhevoy is rounding the Daugava breakwater under her own power, her bow turning north into the Gulf of Riga, on a heading for the Gulf of Finland, the Neva, and the Aurora at her mooring above the embankment in Leningrad. Every shortwave transmitter in her radio room is broadcasting Sablin's tape on the open military frequency, in clear voice, on every band the ship carries. By 0200 hours, the chairman of the KGB is awake in his apartment in Moscow. Yuri Andropov is on the line to the defense minister. The defense minister is on the line to the Baltic Fleet commander. The Baltic Fleet commander is on the line to the air base at Tukums. A Krivac-class frigate at flank speed makes about 32 knots. Leningrad is more than 400 nautical miles from Riga, across 2 gulfs and the open Baltic. There is no possibility, on any honest reading of a chart, that the Storozhevoy will reach the Neva before sunrise. There is every possibility that what reaches her before sunrise will come from the sky. Will a Soviet attack squadron sink a Soviet warship full of Soviet sailors? And if the order is given, who in that squadron will be the man to drop the first bomb? 5:45 hours on the 9th of November. The Storozhevoy is steaming north at 28 knots, almost 60 nautical miles out of Riga into international water. The radio room is still broadcasting on every band. Sailor Shine stands at the door of the radio room with the Makarov on his hip. Sablin is on the bridge. The ship's wake is straight as a ruler in the grey first light. The first thing he hears is the engine note overhead. Yak-28 attack aircraft from Tukums come in low under broken cloud. 12 machines in 3 flights of 4. They have orders, signed within the last hour by the defense minister himself, to disable the rudder of the Storozhevoy by any means short of sinking her. They have not been told why a Soviet warship is heading for Leningrad with her broadcast turned up. They have been told to put her propellers in the water. The first bombs miss by a wide margin. 1 aircraft drops on a Soviet merchantman, a freighter that happens to be on a similar heading 3 kilometers ahead. Sources still disagree about exactly which freighter took that first bomb and how badly she was damaged. What is certain is that at least 1 merchant sailor who had never heard of Valery Sablin in his life was wounded that morning by a bomb meant for someone else. The second pass finds the right ship. A pair of high-explosive bombs strikes the stern of the Storozhevoy near the waterline. The steering gear takes a direct hit. The ship slews 15 degrees to port, and the helm goes dead. From the radio room, the broadcast keeps running. From the bridge, Sablin holds his course as long as the ship will answer her engines, which is no longer for long. Mi-8 helicopters appear over the foredeck. Marines drop on lines onto the helicopter pad behind the funnel. There is small arms fire in the corridors below the bridge. There is no fire from the bridge. Sablin has given no order to resist. He has, in fact, given no order at all for the last 12 minutes. He is standing at the chart table with the radio repeater speaker on his shoulder, listening to his own voice from the recorder room, still reading the manifesto into the open frequency. 2 decks down, the captain breaks out of his compartment. Accounts differ on how. Some say a junior officer slipped the pin out of the locking bar when the ship slewed. Others say Petulny himself shouldered the door off its frame when the second bomb hit. What is certain is that Captain Second Rank Anatoly Petulny appeared on the bridge ladder at about 0700 hours with a pistol he had retrieved from his sea cabin's small arms locker, and that he came up the ladder ahead of the Marines. He sees Sablin at the chart table. Sablin sees the captain coming up the ladder. Sablin could, in this last minute, do several things. He could draw the small arms pistol he is wearing on a webbing belt and shoot Captain Petulny on the bridge. He could turn and run for the wing and try to lose himself among the Marines who are now boarding from the helicopters. He could pull the cassette from the recorder, walk to the wing rail, and drop the tape into the Baltic, where nobody will ever find it. He does none of those things. He stays at the chart table. He keeps the radio repeater speaker on his shoulder. He lets the broadcast continue. Patolny shoots him through the right leg. Sablin goes down without a sound. The pistol on his belt clatters across the chart-house deck. A Marine sergeant from the boarding party arrives on the bridge 30 seconds later and pulls the cassette out of the recorder. The broadcast ends mid-sentence at a phrase that, by witness statements taken 3 weeks later, was the word people. The folder with the steel paperclip is found inside Sablin's tunic when the medical orderlies cut his trousers away. The Storozhevoy was towed back into Riga that afternoon. The crew was interned by the KGB. Sailor Shine was taken off in a separate boat and disappeared into the prison system for the next 8 years. Sablin was moved to a military hospital under guard. The trial took place through the spring and early summer of 1976, in closed session at the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR. The charge began as anti-state activity. It was upgraded by a decision the chairman of the KGB himself signed off on, to treason against the motherland. The penalty for treason against the motherland under Article 64 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic was death by firing squad. The verdict was handed down on the 13th of July, 1976. The execution was carried out on the 3rd of August, 1976, in the courtyard of Lefortovo prison. Sablin was 37 years old. The official cause of death, recorded on the family's notification, was a phrase that did not include the word treason. The folder of more than 40 typed pages was sealed into a KGB archive in Moscow and would not be seen again, in fragments, until the 1990s. Nina Sablina was told of the execution 2 months after the fact. She was asked to return her husband's officer cap. She raised her son alone in a country that pretended his father had never existed. Captain First Rank Mikhail Petrovich Sablin, the father who had cleaned a service revolver at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, asked twice in writing to be told where his son was buried. He was not told. He died in 1979. In 1984, an American novelist published a thriller about the officers of a Soviet missile submarine who tried to defect. The film made him famous in 2 languages. He told interviewers that he had not heard of the Storozhevoy. The few writers who had heard of her noticed, as they had to, that the manuscript was finished 9 years after a Soviet political officer had tried, with a typewriter and a tape, to do something not unlike it. In the early 1990s, the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation reviewed the case. The charge of treason was reduced to disobedience of orders. The death sentence was reduced to a term of imprisonment the dead man could not serve. Full rehabilitation was refused. The Aurora is still at her mooring on the Neva. Nobody on her foredeck remembers the warship that once turned her bow toward her at 0100 hours on a November morning. Captain Third Rank Valery Mikhailovich Sablin took a Soviet warship to sea against the Politburo of the Soviet Union, not to defect, not for money, not for asylum, not for fame. He took her because the alternative was to keep teaching his own sailors that the system worked. He could have stopped at the captain's hatch. He could have pulled the tape from the recorder when the first bomb fell. He could have walked off the bridge when the Marines came over the rail. He did not. If a story about one officer who refused to keep teaching a lie has stayed with you, there are more like it on the channel. Subscribe if you want the next one delivered when it lands.